Hello and welcome to episode 394 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert. As always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing? Have you got the World Cup fever?
I have got a bit of World Cup fever like everybody else because we've had it in the office, and if you'd been watching our Insta stories, I actually gave a bit of an insight, a sort of peek behind the curtain, behind the scenes on how we record the podcast. And not every week are you and I in the same room, Andy. So if you were following our stories, you would have seen me record a piece about how we sometimes are in different locations and we're not even recording at the same time because there was a game going on in the background of the piece on Insta stories this week where I explained that some of the piece on this podcast I recorded in isolation on my own one evening in the studio at work while Andy was elsewhere. So yes, I have got a bit of the World Cup fever like probably most people, and we'll just have to see how it pans out.
Yeah, and while we're talking about the World Cup, we were careful when we announced the dates of our podcast meetup not to include a day when it might be a day when the World Cup was on, just so we could make sure that we could maximise the amount of people coming. So this is a good time to remind our listeners that we are doing a podcast meetup on Thursday the 8th of December from between 6 and 6:30 at Leadenhall Market. We're going to choose a pub, a bar to go to there. Details of the exact venue will be available soon via the podcast and also on our socials, and it'll be great if you can make it.
And also make sure you go to moneytothemasses.com/events because everything about the meetup is going to be there. Leadenhall Market is actually the birthplace of Money to the Masses back in 2010 where the idea was formed. So that's why we go back there. And also it's got a big cover and there's lots of pubs so you can drink outside as well, but we might just stay there where you can buy drinks from multiple pubs and drink outside, or we might find a venue if it's a bit chilly. So make sure you put that in your diary. As Andy said, there is no football on those days. We made sure of it. And please do make an effort to come down because I want people to meet the team and I want the team to meet listeners because it's incredibly motivating. When we've done this in previous years, it provides a real buzz and energy going forward that we actually get to meet people who enjoy what we do and actually find things useful, because obviously we're in the studio when we do these podcasts and we push it out and we don't get necessarily any sense of the thousands and thousands of people who listen to us each week. And it's also a good excuse for listeners to meet other listeners and form friendships and stuff like that, and just to have a drink because it's Christmas. So please do come to that event. So moving on then, Andy, I'm going to tell you what's going to be on the podcast this week. We've got 3 pieces because last week we only had 2 pieces. So I'm going to do a piece on investing. So it's going to be a winter portfolio update. I haven't talked about this for a couple of years, but there's a seasonal anomaly where stock markets have a stronger period between November, so now, and the end of April. So I'm going to explain about that and how you can exploit it. I'm going to do a piece on electric cars versus petrol cars, in particular, the cost of filling up a petrol car versus recharging an electric car. Where does that dynamic change? So are electric cars actually cheaper to run than petrol cars? And at what point with the movement in petrol prices and electricity prices does one become more preferential over the other? And the final piece, Andy, you are going to be doing relating to scams.
That's right. I'm just going to be doing a short piece on a scam that's come to light recently regarding QR codes and how you scan those codes and the way that fraudsters can exploit those.
And it's well worth listening to that one because this actually blew my mind, especially if you ever eat out. Think of places like Nando's, etc. One final thing I want to say, Andy, before we move on to the podcast, we got a lot of good feedback last week about the piece on habit. And it's always the way when I finish a podcast, I suddenly think, I should have said that really as well. 2 quick habits that I've also formed over time that are useful are the habit of waiting 24 to 48 hours before buying something. So you find something you like and get in the habit of actually waiting before you purchase it. That then stops you spending, and it equally puts a barrier, a bit of resistance between spending, so you stop those impulse purchases. That's a good habit that's helped me. And the other one that I've started to do is when using some of the modern app-only banks where they allow you to use pots so you can put money in and actually budget at the beginning of the month using a pot to set money aside, but then when I go to have to spend it, you have to move the money out of the pot into the main part of the account. So think of things like Monzo and Starling, apps like that, and then you can actually spend it. Or even if you use your credit card, you can then transfer the money, pay off your credit card immediately when you use the credit card. All I'm doing is putting layers, barriers of having to move money across that actually you're less likely to start spending. So again, it puts friction in the process. There's some good habits there to get into. Right, let's get on with the podcast.
Yeah, so this is about the winter portfolio, something you brought to the listeners' attention a couple of years ago now. We didn't do an update last winter, and so with it being November now, it's the perfect time to do an update.
So if you go back to podcast 244, so this is back in 2019, I did a piece on a podcast about winter portfolios, and it was inspired by a piece of 80/20 investor research. Now, in that piece of research, I explained how it was possible to exploit a seasonal trend. And that seasonal trend is for stock markets to do better in the winter period. So there's a 6-month period that starts at the beginning of November through to the end of April, which is more positive based on history, if you look at the evidence, than the alternative 6 months of the year. So it's a strong period of performance for stock markets. And the UK Stock Market Almanac actually showed that from 1984, if you invested £100 over the next 25 years, then your money would have grown to £257 excluding dividends. However, if instead of being invested for the entire period, you only invested between the 1st of November and the 30th of April each year, and in the interim period you just stayed in cash, then your £100 would be worth £341 after that 25-year period. If, on the other hand, you had just invested over the summer months, then your £100 would be worth just £69. So that is a seasonality that exists, and a bit like the sell in May idea, these are interesting things you could look at and see if you can exploit them, but of course they're not guaranteed in any way. So what I did was, at the time, which was 2019, when I did the original piece of research, I looked back at the previous 10 years and identified funds that were in the UK stock market. And interestingly, there is a bias where this trend seems to occur in UK smaller companies funds. So I identified funds that had done well or performed well over the previous 10 winters and then built a portfolio out of it. And like I said, you can go back to episode 244 where I explain in more detail about the construction of those portfolios. So out of that research, I produced a consistent winter portfolio and a slightly more aggressive winter portfolio where I allowed the funds to not have to have performed strongly in each of the last 10 winters. And what's interesting is when you do a piece of research where you put your flag in the ground and then say, right, these are the funds or this is the system, and we're going to follow it into the future to see what happens to prove the robustness of the research. So I did it with my perfect ISA portfolio where I analysed a perfect portfolio that had produced positive returns in tax years going back to the year 2000. And I've been continuing following that into the future and seeing how it performs each year. This is the same thing, but with a winter bias. Now, 2 years ago, in episode 297 of this podcast, I reviewed how those portfolios were getting on a year after their construction. So go back and listen to that episode. I won't go over what happened in that year, but that was the pandemic year, which is always a difficult year when it comes to investing. So I wanted this year, given it was 2 years since I last looked at this, just give people an overview of what's actually occurred. And again, this came from an 80/20 investor research piece that I carried out this week, which is an update to that original piece of research. So the highlights are, first of all, 2021 was an awesome year for the winter portfolio. If you listen to the podcast episode that I did 2 years ago, I suggest that this could be a good winter for a strategy like this. Well, that was a bit of an understatement because the consistent winter fund portfolio, which I built, which is a slightly more conservative one, that made 38.85% during that winter period, which is between November and April. The aggressive version of the portfolio made 46.98%. So that is unbelievable. But jump to 2021's winter period, so from November 2021 to the end of April this year, of course, the market collapsed because we had the war in Ukraine. And so if you take a benchmark of the FTSE 250, for example, it ultimately has finished this year, if you'd been investing in it for the whole time, it's down around about 20%. Now, the consistent winter fund portfolio, so this is the more cautious one that I'm going to talk about now going forward, that is currently down around about 8% this year. So 8.86% because it went into cash at the end of April. So the end of April, that's how much it was down. It's been in cash ever since. Of course, the markets kept tumbling. So following this winter strategy with UK equities, because that was where the focus was when I did the original piece of research, has actually heralded a negative result, but you were down 8% versus being down over 20% if you've been in the FTSE 250. The reason I reference the FTSE 250 is because when I carried out the research, it actually worked out that UK smaller companies was where this trend worked the best when I was looking at UK equities. And that is not surprising because another piece of research, just to remind you, I carried out for 80/20 Investor, found that when you use active funds, certain sectors, active funds do actually manage to outperform their index tracking peers. And smaller companies in the UK is one of those areas. So FTSE 250 trackers do tend to underperform some of the active funds if you're lucky and you pick the right ones, of course, but tend to broadly underperform active funds that invest in the same area. So while the winter portfolio was a roaring success in 2021 and you're down around about 8% this year, across the 2 years you'd still be up 26-27%, whereas with the FTSE 250 you'd only be up about 10.7%. So it has been a winning strategy in that regard, because don't forget, you've only been invested half of the time. Winters you're invested, summers you're in cash. So from a risk return perspective, it has been very strong. Now, of course, you will get up and down years, like we've had a down year this year. We had a very up year in the winter of 2020 into 2021. But if you look at the long-term performance of this trend, if you had invested during the winter since 2009 all the way through to this November in 2022, so that's more than 13 years. If you just simply follow the process of being invested during the winter, cashing out in the summer and repeating that process, remember the winter is November to the end of April, then assuming you'd followed the portfolio that I'd picked, which is a number of actively managed UK smaller companies funds, you'd be up over 215%. A FTSE tracker that had been invested the entire time would be up around about 183%. The FTSE 100 would be up around 130%, and the FTSE 350, which is a combination of the FTSE 250 and the FTSE 100, would be up around about 135%. So you can see the strategy does seem to work over the longer term. Now, those of you listening regularly know I run my own 50k portfolio on 80/20 Investor, and I actually benefited from riding this phenomena in 2020 to 2021. Not so much last year, but the fund that I mentioned previously, the Fidelity Fund, I actually had that in my own 50k portfolio and I benefited handsomely from its performance over the period. But of course, past performance is not a guide to future returns, as everybody knows. So telling you this, what do you do with that? Now, one takeaway is that it is possible to exploit seasonal trends. The second is that you can't guarantee that they'll work every year. In some years, they can significantly underperform. The other thing I would take away from this is that if you are planning on trying to exploit a seasonal trend, there is a benefit in using a fund, so something that invests in lots of different companies, because this original piece of research was inspired by Interactive Investors' Wild Winter portfolios, and they do this but with individual shares. Now, if you look at last year's results, they were disastrous, and somebody actually wrote into me to mention this to me, so thank you, Tony. I'll just mention you on the podcast quickly. If I look at their portfolios, they were down between 20 and 25%. So they had a more conservative and aggressive one because they invest in individual shares. The message is, if you're going to try and use a seasonal trend that you read anywhere in the press and people are trying to exploit it, again, diversifying through funds and trying to exploit that trend does tend to help minimize the volatility and the overexposure to individual companies. So they are down 25% in their examples. This is Interactive Investor because they invested in a selection of individual shares. If you try to do it via a fund, as I suggested, then you're only looking at a loss of just over 8% this year. Interestingly, 2022 has been a fantastic year for the FTSE 100 because of its exposure to oil and gas stocks and its lack of exposure to technology stocks. So actually, this year, being in a FTSE 100 tracker would have been the best thing of all if you're investing in UK equities or being invested in UK larger companies that weren't technology stocks but had some exposure to the energy sector. So looking at the annualized return, just to give people a quick recap, don't forget, if you want to look at the portfolios that I'm talking about, the ones that I built, you can take a free trial of 80/20 Investor. But of course, you could just go and analyze funds yourself over the last 10 years and pick the ones that have done the best and try and build a portfolio if that's the sort of thing you'd like to have a bit of fun with. But obviously that's not advice in any way. The annualized return of the portfolio that I built, the conservative one, was 9.2%, which is obviously very good. That's since 2009, so the 13-year period. The FTSE 100, the annualized return is 6.3%. The FTSE 250 is just over 8%, while the FTSE 350 is 6.6%. So you can see that the return has been obviously better doing this seasonality approach. What's interesting is the stats. So if you look at things like Sharpe ratio, which is the extra return you get for the risk you're taking, the Sharpe ratio on the consistent winter portfolio is 0.53. That is more than double any of the others. And that's because half the time it's in cash, but you're getting that extra return despite being in cash. Volatility is much lower as well. And it's beta, which I like as a measure of how it responds to market movements. And beta, a measure of 1, means that if the wider market, which in this case I use the wider market being the FTSE 250, moves up, then your portfolio, if it had a beta of 1, would move in lockstep. Well, the consistent winter portfolio has a beta of 0.4, which means it's got a very low correlation to the wider market. And that's again because it's in cash. And obviously the alpha generation is much higher anyway as well. So you can look at those stats if you want to. Interestingly, again, it's not recommendation. The top performer was one I mentioned 2 years ago, actual fund. The Fidelity UK Smaller Companies Fund is in that portfolio, consistent portfolio, and it has been the best performer. And I finished off that show 2 years ago by saying, there's hope that this idea of a winter portfolio might do quite well into 2021, and it did prove so. Actually, I'm looking at the numbers for the winter so far since the beginning of November, and some of these funds are actually already up 7-8%. Now, of course, they could crash, and we are in the middle of a bear market after all, and an impending recession, but it is interesting nonetheless. So if you're into seasonalities, or you just want to have a bit of fun and have a look at see how some of these UK smaller companies funds do over the winter period, just for your own notebook, then by all means go and have a look and do your own research.
Moving on to the next piece then, the cost of running a petrol car versus charging an electric vehicle.
Yes, so this piece has been inspired by some of my own thought process and questions I've had around electric cars versus petrol cars and what's been going on in the UK. I mean, we had surge in petrol prices earlier in the year, and lots of people were saying, I'm thinking I might end up getting an electric car. And of course, the costs up front have been prohibitive. And for most people, me included, I couldn't afford to have an electric car. But it started to make people want to do the numbers. But the information out there isn't readily available. I mean, we can all see how much an electric car costs versus its petrol equivalent. We can see that. But what about running costs? And in particular, the energy side. So the refilling of your car, how much it costs to actually run the car in terms of energy. So petrol versus electricity used to recharge it. And I actually got in touch with Cornwall Insight. So they're the people who you will hear on TV or radio or whatever about where the energy price cap will be in the future. They've been spookily accurate in predicting where it will be. So whenever you see bills are going to go up to X amount of thousands next year, it's Cornwall Insight, whose name is often referred to because they do the research. And we've talked about them on previous episodes of this podcast. We've been talking about the price of energy. And I actually got in touch with them and had a good chat with them about trying to do some research into the cost of running an electric car versus petrol. I'm looking at just the fuel costs here. Now, in the end, it was proving quite difficult. And I thought, I'm going to just crunch the numbers myself. And now I don't have an electric car. I've never used one. So I'm going to have to caveat this while doing this piece. But I'm just initially trying to answer that question. Let's ignore the upfront cost of a car. How smug are electric car owners over the cost of charging their car up? Is it much cheaper than filling a car up using petrol and running a petrol car? At what point does that dynamic change? For example, if the price of petrol at the pump plummets, at what point does it become cheaper than running electric, if it ever does? But equally, with energy prices soaring, then surely electric car owners are starting to sweat. And at which point are they sweating? And which point are they no longer as smug about the fact that it's cheaper to run an electric car, or is it even cheaper to run an electric car? I'm talking about the cost per mile, because we never see that anywhere. And when I spoke to Cornwall Insight, it's because there are lots of moving parts. It's quite a difficult thing to do, but that didn't stop me attacking the mathematics behind it. So with the caveat out the way that I don't use an electric car, I'm just looking at the numbers. There are lots of moving parts to this because you've got to think there are different cars, there are different ways people drive, there are different efficiencies, it depends on where they drive, what kind of car they have, all of that kind of stuff. I'm giving some headline numbers here that I've actually crunched. Now, it would be good if people who do have these cars, electric cars, started a conversation about their experiences in the Money to the Masses group, because I'd be intrigued at what are their actual experiences of using an electric car. Have they saved a lot of money? Now, I'm going to focus on the running costs in terms of petrol price versus charging. And at the end of this piece, I am actually going to do a quick bit on the upfront costs as well. So comparing that to the overall running costs, because there's been some interesting research carried out. Now, it will affect us all, this electric versus petrol, because don't forget, in 2030, you won't be able to buy new petrol or diesel cars. And of course, the other thing, the reason it came on the radar again is because the road tax exemption is going to be scrapped on electric cars in 2025. So listen to Andy's piece on the podcast last week. So that is one of the attractions of electric cars that's going to be removed. So first of all, I looked at the cost of running my car. Now, I've got a boring car. I've got a Kia. You can tell I've got a family. You can also tell I don't care less about cars, to be honest. Now, my car has about 50 litres. That's the tank. So if you fill it up, that equates to 11 gallons. Now, assuming that the price of petrol is £1.60 a litre, so 160 pence a litre, which it is roughly at the moment as I make this podcast, it costs me £80 to fill up that tank. Now, how many miles can I get on that tank of petrol? You need to know the miles per gallon for your car. I found a really useful tool online. This is a side note. So go to confused.com/fuel-cost-calculator. Of course, I'll put a link in the show notes. You type in your registration, it will tell you the miles per gallon for your car. Now, I know miles per gallon vary depending on how you drive, and also what they quote and what you get can be very different, but that is a good steer. So using that miles per gallon, my car should do 385 miles on that £80 tank. Now that means the cost per mile, so the pence per mile for me to drive, is 20.77 pence. Now, I went and looked at PodPoint. They're the people who put the chargers out there that you can use out in public spaces. Now, if you look at their website, they say that it costs £15.10 to fully charge an electric car based on an assumption that it's a 60 kilowatt battery that will do 200 miles approximately. Now, you need to compare like with like. So I ended up working out how much based upon the numbers that they've used, and it's assuming a 28 pence per kilowatt hour charging rate at home. Now, I'm ignoring any special tariffs. I'm using the research that they've done, and this is based in September. We're now in November, so I'll come on to that because prices have changed. That means that it costs £15.10 to fully charge your car if it's electric, based upon those assumptions, which works out at 7.55 pence per mile. That is mind-boggling. That is almost a third of the cost. Now, of course, when people talk about petrol prices and electric cars, it's hard to visualize it. So pence per mile is a good way of doing it. So that's 7.55p versus what I worked out for my car, which is 20.77p per mile. Now, think of it another way. If you can only think in pence per litre, we're currently paying £1.60, so 160 pence per litre at the moment. The equivalent for an electric car, it's like electric car drivers getting fuel at 58.14 pence per litre. That's how much cheaper it is. Now, of course, prices have changed. So I did the numbers and crunched them again. So at the moment, under the energy price guarantee, the pence per kilowatt hour people pay is 34p per kilowatt hour. That means that for that electric car to be fully charged is now £18.34. That's 9.17 pence per mile, which equates to somebody being able to fill their car up, if it was petrol, let's pretend, 70.59 pence per litre. We're all paying 160 pence per litre when we're using petrol. And of course, there is that argument that the energy price guarantee is subsidising the travel of people who can afford electric cars. I won't get into that. Now, what's going to happen when the energy price goes up? Now, Cornwall Insight are the people who look at the energy price cap and predict it in the future, and they've been spookily accurate. They have predicted that the pence per kilowatt hour will go up to 66.76 in Q1 of 2023. So that's almost twice what it is now. And then they think it will drop down to 58 28.69 pence per kilowatt hour. What does that mean for electric car users? Well, that means if you're charging at home, I'll get on to charging elsewhere in a second. If you're charging at home, you're going to be paying 18p a mile in Q1, but you won't because of the energy price guarantee. But once we get off of that, what you really need to focus on is that if we all are paying for our energy again at the market rate, you'll be paying 15.83 pence per mile, which therefore takes your equivalent pence per litre to 121.86. That's creeping up towards something like what petrol cars are paying. I mean, we're paying 160 at the moment, but 121, the saving isn't as great because the electricity prices are going up. If oil prices were to fall, then they might start to move towards each other. Where this might get interesting is if you use rapid charging, so you're at the motorway services, then the equivalent price is much higher because you get charged a higher rate. Now, they reckon the pence per kilowatt hour back in September is 44. That made the price to charge at the motorway 12 pence per mile, which is the equivalent of a 94 pence per litre petrol price. If we assume the energy price increase that Cornwall Insight are predicting for the second quarter of 2023, and we applied that in a way that is mathematically correct, but we don't know it's going to come through in this way, we're going to have a similar increase in the price at these rapid charging points, then you're going to be paying a lot more. You're going to be paying 25.62 pence per mile, or the equivalent of 197 pence per litre. That means you'll be almost paying the equivalent of somebody driving a petrol car who pays £2 a litre. That is on the basis of where they're predicting prices will go in the future. Of course, those predictions might not be true, but when I spoke to Cornwall Insight back a couple of months ago now, they were saying that there were charging points, because obviously the price you pay at these different charging places vary if you're not at home. They were saying that at that point already, when the energy prices were suddenly spiking, and that there were some places where they were being charged prices that were already at that point making it that it was no longer cheaper to run an electric car if you use some of the really expensive charging points, because energy prices were soaring and they weren't being protected under the government's emergency measures. So that is interesting. I mean, where we are now at the moment, electric cars are much cheaper to run when it comes to the energy cost than petrol cars. But if petrol prices just stay the same and energy prices go where they're predicted to, that dynamic is going to change. Now, hopefully, after listening to all that, you have now got a better visualization about the cost of running an electric car. And it's not going to be perfect. There are assumptions in there, but it just gives you a steer where we are at the moment. What about the overall cost? Now, interestingly, the Express and the Times did separate bits of research about the upfront cost versus the ongoing costs of running a car. They didn't quite agree exactly as to the difference. But if you focus on the Times results, they have actually put a table together for 3 different cars. It was a BMW, a Ford Focus, and another car. And I'll put a link in the show notes, you can look at it. And they looked at the petrol and the equivalent electric versions of the car. They looked at the initial price. They looked at the estimated servicing and maintenance and repair costs, the cost of fuel, the insurance, road tax, all over a 3-year period, and worked out which was cheaper. Now, they actually got, this is the Times when they did their research, they got Auto Trader to help them, and they effectively across all 3 examples worked out that after 3 years, the reduction in running costs meant that you got back the money that you'd spent on the initial extra outlay on the electric car, and in some instances you were £1,000 or so better off. Now, that's based on a lot of assumptions. We're looking at the numbers, the biggest savings, because actually when I'm looking at a lot of the 3 cars, broadly speaking, yes, the cost of the electric car was much bigger. They claim the maintenance costs were lower. Presumably maybe it's because there aren't so many combustion parts. The fuel was one of the biggest areas where you save. Insurance was higher on the electric in most instances, and road tax was another big saving because you didn't obviously pay road tax. Now, if electric prices go up and road tax exemption is being removed, then that differential is going to be lost, and it will mean that it take you longer than 3 years to recoup that loss. And in fact, the Express's research suggests it was a little bit longer than that anyway. So electric cars, there's no agenda here. This is just looking at numbers. Electric cars are clearly now getting to the point where for some people who can afford the upfront cost, they can sit there and think because of the preferential rates you effectively get on fueling and road tax, then that helps to offset a lot of that initial outlay and they can justify the spend. And of course, there is the environmental benefit as well. And the other point to highlight is that if we are all going to have to buy electric cars, then hopefully the cost of electric cars will start to tumble in the coming years. But the one thing that I would throw out there, if everybody switches to electric cars, then what will happen to fuel duty? Because don't forget, the government expects to earn fuel duty of 26.2 billion in the year 2022 to 2023, which is the equivalent to £930 per household. So if we suddenly stopped using so much fuel, then their receipts will start to drop. And given the direction of travel that the government's already shown, which is that they will start taxing electric cars because you are now going to have to pay road tax, then presumably they will start to apply some form of taxation to the way that cars are recharged, maybe, to be able to offset that drop in receipts. So just something I was going to throw out there, because almost 30% of the money that we spend on petrol is actually fuel duty. So something will likely give in the future. So I'm not convincing anybody to buy electric cars, not to buy electric cars, but just to further on the conversation beyond how much they cost up front and relating it to something that people can understand, which is energy prices and pence per litre.
I'm glad you crunched those numbers, Damien, because it's something I've been considering, and obviously we're all going to have to start considering it in years to come as 2030 approaches. And I suppose one thing just to quickly mention, you haven't obviously factored into your numbers the times when you can charge your car for free, because we know there are incentives out there. There are places where you can charge your car for free, certain supermarkets, McDonald's. When you're visiting family members, perhaps work has an incentive that you can charge your car there. This doesn't include those situations because, of course, just relying on being able to do it for free like that isn't really sustainable in the long term.
Right, Andy, moving on to the QR scam piece that we mentioned at the start of the podcast.
Yeah, so it's just a quick piece really, and we touch on scams from time to time, and this is one that's been highlighted recently in a number of places, and so I thought it was a good opportunity to mention it on the podcast just to make our listeners aware. And the scam centres around QR codes. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware what a QR code is, but for those that don't, it's a square box that you'll see in a number of places now. They tend to flash them up on TV, and they're available on websites, apps, newspapers, magazines, and even on menus in restaurants now. And it's a square box that will have lots of black and white within it, similar to a barcode, but rather than vertical or horizontal lines, it's a series of squares and rectangles. And anyone who scans that with their phone, most smartphones will be able to do it straight from the camera, but there are other apps that are specifically designed to read these QR codes. And what your camera and these specialist apps will do is decode that message and send the person to the relevant place. And it will normally be a website where there'll be some further information. Now, QR codes have been around for a few years now, but it's only really in the last year that we've really seen an increase in the use and popularity of these. And the fraudsters, as always, like to keep up with the latest trends. And now there are lots of scams that have been brought to people's attention that involve QR codes. Why it's especially important to get the message out there is that, according to research, around 85% of smartphone users have actually scanned one of these codes in the last year, and around 35% of people regularly scan a QR code every week. So I'm going to highlight two quick QR scams which are doing the rounds at the moment so that you are aware. The first one is in emails. Scammers are now beginning to embed these malicious QR codes within emails, with the idea being that they impersonate a reputable organization or brand, and that could be something like Microsoft Office or HMRC. And the email will ask the recipient to scan the code, and in one of the examples we've seen, they've asked them to pay their overdue tax. So for all intents and purposes, the person scanning that will think they are within HMRC, and that is where the fraud will take place. So it's really just to be aware that this scam does exist. Be super careful now where you see QR codes. And there's a few things that you can do just to protect yourself. So firstly, when you receive a QR code in an email, do look out for typos. Make sure that it is an official correspondence from that organization. So there shouldn't be any spelling or grammar mistakes on that email. And the website that you're taken to, again, it should be an official looking site. Check the URL of that site. Check the font and the text size within the site as well. Make sure it's consistent. Make sure it looks and feels real. And if you're unsure, don't do anything further. Come away from that URL, maybe even use a separate device and find that website separately via your own means rather than through the QR code, and continue doing whatever you needed to do via that way instead of via the QR code. Again, check the email that you've been sent as well. Is it from a domain name that is similar to the official one but not quite right? So do check, because often when you're speed reading something, it looks genuine, but when you look at the spelling, there'll be a letter maybe missing, or there may be a dot in between certain words. Again, if it looks official, but then it's coming from a Google or Hotmail account, that would be a warning sign. So make sure you check for that too. And if you think you've received an email that is a scam, make sure you do report it to Action Fraud, and we'll put details within the show notes on how to do that. Another popular scam at the moment is where the fraudsters are actually printing off their own QR codes and replacing existing QR codes with their own. So they are literally putting a sticker over an existing QR code, and that can be very difficult to spot. And popular places where this is happening is busy restaurants. So you need to be super careful and super aware. So if you're in a restaurant that uses QR codes for their menus and for paying, double check with the restaurant itself that the QR code that you're looking at is legitimate. Check to see if it's been tampered with. If it's raised slightly, that might be an indication that a QR code has been placed on top. And of course, while we embrace technology and restaurants are using QR codes to speed up service, you can, of course, decline to use that method, because not everyone has a smartphone, and so they will be set up for taking orders and payment in the usual way. So if you're at all uncomfortable, then of course you can go down the traditional route of asking for a menu and paying with your card. A couple of final tips on maybe how to spot a QR code for signs that is fraudulent. Again, check to see for signs of whether it's been tampered with or replaced or covered up with a fake version. And just make sure that that QR code is in a place where you expect it and it's not being placed somewhere that looks particularly unusual or random. If you've already scanned a QR code and then you realise that this might be malicious, check for signs that the website you're on is a phishing website. And again, you're looking for missing branding, spelling mistakes, and also if it's asking you to share too much personal information, more than you would deem necessary for what you're trying to do. And finally, only scan a QR code if you're absolutely sure about it. And if you are at all unsure, don't scan it. Look for other methods of doing what it is you need to do, whether that be asking for menus, typing in an email or web address manually. There are always other ways to do these things. QR codes were brought in to embrace technology and simplify our life, but of course, scammers are always looking for new ways to be able to defraud us. So just be super, super careful. And very lastly, there are third-party apps that have additional security. So if you're used to scanning via your usual smartphone camera, while they will have security embedded within it, you can get third-party apps via the App Store which have additional security. And those QR scanners are developed by security firms. So theoretically, at least, they should provide you with a little bit more peace of mind. And Damien, just before I finish off, there was news this week about the UK's biggest anti-fraud operation. You've probably heard about it in the news, but just to make people aware that the police this week have contacted around 70,000 people that they believe have been the victim of a sophisticated banking scam. Now, the details are quite complex, but again, it's a phishing scam that has been taking place for many years. Fraudsters have been using a service whereby they can impersonate your bank, whether that be Lloyds, NatWest, TSB, Nationwide, Barclays, Santander, and following a successful operation, they've been able to gather the details of around 70,000 people that they believe have been a victim. Now, the unfortunate thing is the only details they have of the victims is their phone number. And while it's not the best way to go about things, the quickest way for the police to contact these people is to send them a text message to advise them that they may have been the victim of a scam and the next steps. So just to make you aware that the police have sent out a message to every one of these victims, and the message went out on the 23rd and 24th of November. So if you're listening to this on Sunday the 27th, that will be 3 or 4 days ago. If you received a text out of the blue that tells you might have been a victim of the scam, it could well have been as a part of this police operation. Again, obviously, it's not ideal because they're using a similar method that fraudsters would use, and so you do need to be vigilant. But the police have been very specific in saying that the messages were only sent on the 23rd and 24th of November, and they are not asking you to do anything other than visit the Action Fraud website. And from there, they would like you to register your details so that the police officers involved in the case can build cases against the suspects. So So, Damien, I think that's pretty much it for this week. Don't forget about the podcast meetup in London on Thursday, the 8th of December. Go to moneytothemasses.com/events for more information. Damien, we're pretty much done, aren't we?
Yeah, that's it. We're done. Of course, don't forget to review the podcast. We always leave it too late to remind people to do it. They've probably switched off by now. Please review the podcast. It helps us move up those iTunes charts. So, Andy, that's it. Until next time.
Until next time.